everybody! Welcome back to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend Charles. I was really feeling the intro music that time.
Yeah.
I was hitting some dance moves. So I wish sometimes that the listeners could be viewers.
Ooh,
but
don't we all?
Unfortunately, yeah, that is not an option right now, and I'm
or maybe fortunately,
really,
but I guess
yeah.
No, you were looking good. You're doing some good moves because it's an exciting day because we've got another book to talk about.
Well, we do. There's good reason why I was hitting the dance moves hard, because we're going to be covering... yeah, mind blown, right, Charles?
Well done, Dylan. I didn't even see that coming. That's how incredible you are as a lifelong friend and co-host, because yes,
incredible friend for dancing there. Yes, we'll be covering a book that you read, Charles, that you're going to give recommendation for. We're doing back-to-back weeks of this, because I did This Is How You Lose the Time War last week, and
that's right.
Yeah,
we've got a lot to read on the reading schedule. We've promised to do all kinds of other books, and we've got our Friends Pitching Fantasy series that we're reading through. So all of those things are going on, but that doesn't mean we're not still reading other things at the same time. So I had the distinct privilege of getting to read A Dance of Cloaks in my downtime, and now that it is finished, I was like, well, I've read it, so I'm here to talk about it, and that's what we're here to do today. We are discussing...
And I'm mostly here to dance.
Yes.
Unfortunately, I have no cloaks. Although I did once have a sort of cheap cloak that I would wear to playing Dungeons and Dragons, because I would play the rogue.
I was like...
And I'd be like, yeah, whenever I'd go stealth, I would like throw the cloak over my head. And with how bad I don't want to mess up my hair, you have to know how much commitment I was putting in, Charles, when I would throw the hood of the cloak over my head. So that meant a lot to everyone around me, I'm sure.
It is a sad day that you didn't bring it into the recording. I guess there's always next time, but today, we just got the dancing, and we've got A Dance of Cloaks to talk about by David Dalglish. This book came into my life in an interesting way. A coworker of mine who, we exchange fantasy books back and forth and recommend things to each other. This was part of the stack of books that he had given to me a while back to read, and I've been slowly working my way through the pile, and, you feel bad for holding on to someone else's books, like someone loans you a book, and this whole thing of like, I've got to read it, I got to return it, this and that. So, and I had a bunch too, and then we read all the time, and I have to make sure we get that reading done. So I had to, be consciously making time to go through this, and now we're here. And so when it was recommended to me, I was like, well, I'm excited because, we have pretty similar interests in the fantasy genre, so excited to see. Like, this was not on my radar at all. I had never heard of it. I had never heard of David Dalglish until he was recommended to me through word of mouth at work, and I have since learned quite a bit about him, and finished the first book as well. This beginning of this is kind of interesting. David Dalglish was an indie author for a long time, and this was like the fifth novel that he had written. He had written another series before this one called the Half-Orc series, and it was pretty popular, and there was a character in that who is a main character in this story called, I don't know the actual pronunciation, Haern. I pronounced Hearn, but that's one of the main characters in this story. And he's featured in the Half-Orc series. And then when he was writing more of the backstory for this character, who was your typical rogue like Dylan, throwing the cloak on, running around, man of all trades.
Nice.
He describes him as mysterious, deadly, and basically the ace in the hole if I ever threw the characters into a situation a bit over their heads. That's how he described the character in the Half-Orc series. So as he started to flesh out that backstory, he basically created this whole new series. And it's a pretty long series, the Shadowdance series. I think it's got 6 books in it. But anyway, this was a unique writing process in that at first it was an independently released book, and it got a lot of popularity. I mean, he was selling hundreds of thousands of copies of his books, and it led him to get picked up by Orbit. And when the book was picked up to be published by Orbit, he actually went back with a new editor and redid this book for, professional publication, which I find to be an interesting process. You go from to revisit your old work that was already pretty popular and to work with a professional editor and get it ready for the big leagues. I guess it's kind of interesting to hear him describe that process and what he calls the growing pains of when he wrote that, never thinking, I'm writing it for me and for, the stories I want to tell, publish it myself, self-published, all of that, to oh, now I'm rewriting this as a, air quotes, author who's going to get this book, traditionally published. It seemed to be quite the interesting story. So that's the origins of A Dance of Cloaks. Dylan, have you stumbled on that very often, where you've got the indie author revisiting a work to re-release it traditionally? I'll say, I keep saying professionally, I mean traditionally. Everyone's a professional. If you can write a book, no matter how it's published, thumbs up from me. So we'll say traditionally published.
It kind of reminds me of The Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter. And that's another book that was hugely popular as a self-published book, and then really picked up steam, especially on Reddit, on the horror fantasy community, and then became traditionally published. And I believe he also went back and had to make some changes to it. I know was it Legends and Lattes also recently. I don't know how much rewriting went into that process. I don't know if it was mostly just released by Tor pretty much as it was originally written, but that's another one. And I'm sure our buddy Mark Lawrence, who we just had on the show a couple weeks back, could probably name some others that got traditional deals. I think Senlin Ascends was another one. Josiah Bancroft, I believe. I'm sorry if I butchered that name. I wasn't prepared for that one coming in. But yeah, he also ended up getting a traditional publishing deal out of the whole thing, and I think he went back and did some rewrites. But I'm not sure about the going back and rewriting process, how common that is when these self-published books get deals. I'm pretty sure that Evan Winter did at least a decent amount of that, and the others not positive.
Under Mike Sullivan and Rhaenyra Revelations too, right? He was one of the OG big time independently self-published that kind of got the traditional publishing deal. It's rare that I have researched the process between what happens with the book from when it was self-published to when it gets traditionally published, and what that process is like. David Dalglish was just very upfront about the warts and all of his book when he originally wrote it, which according to this, it says this version was the traditionally published one has a copyright of 2013. And then he says in a note from the author that he had written it, self-published it 2 years prior. And he says, with all its warts and in all its glory. So that was how he described it. And he said, it was written at a feverish pace with a complete anything goes mentality. If I didn't know why a character was doing whatever they were doing, screw it, I'd tie it in later. If plot lines were balls, I was throwing dozens and dozens into the air just to see if I could juggle them all. And the second I thought I was doing it right, I flung one more in for fun. So that's kind of the process that he was going into. And he says he's more under control now, and he thanks his editors, wonderful editor, and this, that, and the other. And he's very proud of the version that he was able to create for traditionally published works. And I think that just goes to show you how much a a book can be, like a movie where you have the director, but then you have a whole team. And I think of like Sanderson's books where he's got like a whole squad. Like the credits for Rhythm of War would be just as long as a Marvel movie in many cases, of all the people that get involved and touch the book. And when you're publishing it by yourself, and it's like, imagine making a movie by yourself with no help, it can be kind of wild. I mean, he mentions he has friends and family and like social media groups that he would collaborate with and things like that, but it's pretty much on your own. So it's kind of interesting to see that spirit carry over into his traditionally published work, and like a more polished work, I'll say, for lack of a better phrase. It's interesting because this book is very much like he described it, anything goes, like, full octane, entertainment driven, like throw a bunch of things out there and just having fun. And that is the strongest part of A Dance of Cloaks. And I guess, 12 minutes in, I should kind of talk about what this book is about. It's very reminiscent to me. When I was reading it, I was like, oh, this is very Brent Weeks, which I know, Dylan, we've got to get you on the Night Angel trilogy, but it's a grimdark series for sure. And it's very much reminds me of Night Angel trilogy, where it's super grim, and then the action is very action packed and cinematic, and it's almost like it reminds me like if Sin City, for example, was a book where it's fun and it's not afraid to be like super over the top with its entertainment and things like that. And that's what this, and like very easily accessible. That's a huge part of what this is. It's like a grim, dark, traditional fantasy D&D kind of setting where there's a kingdom. But what's interesting about it is the kingdom is controlled by various, there's a traditional king, and then there's the government, but then there is a larger ruling factions of thieving crews. And one of the main thieving crews, calls himself a king, and they're all at war with each other. And it's his son, who is this character Heron, that is one of the main characters of the story. But Thurn, I believe, is how you pronounce the king's name. He reminds me of like if Jorg as an adult, basically. It's got a lot of that Prince of Thorns vibes too.
Prince of Thorns, yeah. Mark Lawrence, friend of the show.
It's like Prince of Thorns and Brent Weeks and Mistborn, like that kind of spirit of fantasy telling, with just cloaks flying through the rooftops, people throwing daggers at each other, people betraying each other. I mean, it opens with like a backstabbing and then another backstabbing, and then that guy gets backstabbed. It's very much that kind of like full embrace of the grimdark genre and the cloak and dagger and the roguelike archetypes in the genre. And yeah, the way it fully embraces it, to me, is what drives a lot of the entertainment of the story. It is fun in that way. David Dalglish, has a, like, when I'm reading his like about and stuff, he references video games a lot. He's an American author. He's living when this book was written, he was living in Missouri. I caught an interview of him with Fanfi Addict, right, Dylan? That was the interview we watched, which was great, and highly recommend you watch that. He just seems like a really nice, down-to-earth guy who had just a fun story spinning around in his head that he really wanted to tell. And he had fun characters in his head that he really wanted to get out there. And it just kind of snowballed in support to become a, by popular demand, like picked up by Orbit and distributed across the country, which is a super cool thing to have happen for a self-published author. And it's well deserved. And it's just a fun moment in like the fantasy genre when things like that get to happen.
It really is, and it sounds like it's really cool. One of the things about self-published books is they have the option to do what it sounds like Dalglish did, which is just write whatever they want and not have to worry about like, oh, is this something that can actually be traditionally published in this market? Is like, no, who cares? Like, let's just do whatever I want to do and see what happens. And I think that kind of thing, whether or not it ends up traditionally published eventually, it ends up really coming through to the readers when an author is having fun writing what they're writing. No one wants to read anything that comes off like stiff, or it comes off as though it's trying to pander to whatever the most recent trend is so it can get published traditionally. Like, it's always a joy when you can feel that the writer was enjoying what they're doing.
For sure.
And it sounds like that's a big plus for this novel.
Right. Because of the route that it took, it didn't like get notes from an agent or from a publishing group or a studio. It wasn't part of like, well, I've got a book deal that I just signed and now I have to write a book. Yeah, and it's not like, oh, it's a product of the times, I better turn this out. It's just a story that a guy that likes to tell stories came up with and found an audience and grew it into its own thing. And there's a certain magic when something like that gets more mainstream and you can kind of see the origins of the more grassroots kind of storytelling, because we read a lot of really awesome, super high polished books. I'm looking at my bookshelf right now. I see Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. I see The Spear Cuts Through Water by Simon Jimenez. I see The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. All of these like beautiful gems that are so like written by these literary master authors that are telling we always say capital literature story in using fantasy to bring home those themes. And David Dalglish was like, I'm gonna write like the John Wick of fantasy right now, and I'm gonna just go full octane fun. And that's my approach, and the accessibility of it and the entertainment of it is really the strongest points of it. Like, if you're someone who has been reading even like Brandon Sanderson or Malazan, like that side of fantasy as well, where it just feels really big and sometimes unapproachable, where it's like, oh god, or Wheel of Time or something, where it's like, do I gotta remember all these 200 side characters? Do I have to remember the political factions like in Game of Thrones? Like, who are these two families again? Like, the pressure to feel like you have to follow those things is totally gone in this book. And that's the most impressive thing to me about David Dalglish's writing. Like, he keeps it fun. He throws a lot at you, a lot of balls that he's juggling, and to use his words. But it never feels intimidating. It never feels like slogged at all. It's always moving. You're always right there. He gives you the clues of like, here's the character. Remember this interesting thing about the character. Like, he has that gift of kind of reminding you who a character is. Sometimes you're reading like Wheel of Time and you're like, who's Egwene and who's Elaine and who's like, like Moraine, like who are these characters? You can kind of forget. And he just
shots fired.
I love Wheel of Time, but that's the example I have in my head.
It's a fair shot to fire.
But it's like, he can throw a character at you and you like they're all so distinct and fit this part that like you can identify them immediately. You can roll with the story and you can have fun with it. And every other scene is an action scene or a murder scene or a betrayal scene. I forgot to mention, there's the like government faction, there's thievery and the thieving guilds that are at war, and then there's also this religious pillar too, and they have magical abilities, and of course they're corrupt as well, and have powerful fighters and warriors too. That embraces more of the magical side of fantasy than like the thieving crews are all cloak and dagger. So you get a little bit of everything worked in, and it's really fun. And I was reading more about David Dalglish, and he's like, yeah, I started with a friend. We were making video games in RPG Maker, which is a way you can just make RPGs. And he was like, I found myself like enjoying writing the games more than like the best part for me of making a game was getting to write it. And he's like, why can't I just write then and forget the rest? And this definitely has the vibe of like, if you're playing an M-rated like action RPG, that's very much kind of the story that we're getting here. It was a lot of fun, and it's definitely for us where we always kind of lean towards the grimdark roguelike genre. It's right in there. Like, I'm imagining it's not the fight scenes aren't as like science-based and complex as something like Mistborn, but they're just as like intricate and detailed and exciting as Mistborn was. So that's like the high praise I have for it, and it makes me want to like go back and like revisit like things about Mistborn and things about the Night Angel trilogy, and like put me back and like Mark Lawrence's work in Prince of Thorns. It brings me back to that world of fantasy, which I feel like we kind of haven't touched in a long time. I know we read Prince of Thorns in relatively recent history, but it feels like we haven't kind of dabbled in this kind of fantasy in a while, and I missed it, I missed it.
Yeah, I could totally see how you'd miss a book that's just dedicating itself to fun and entertainment and action. And it reminds me, Charles, you remember when we went to see Mad Max Fury Road with it was you, me, and Derek, our other lifelong friend and your co-host from your Vanity project, Roger, a Star Wars podcast. Check it out if you're a big Star Wars fan. But I remember, you go in something like that, or Pacific Rim is another one.
Yeah, that's a good
And you
one.
go in with this mentality of just like, I'm here for the fun, I'm here for the entertainment, I'm here for the action, and movies like that really deliver if you go in with the right mentality. I mean, meanwhile, you look at something like Mad Max and end up being a total like critical darling and winning all these Oscars for like the editing and the costume design, all that kind of stuff. But I think of that movie, what it managed to do was those things seemed like happenstance of trying to make something that was just entertainment, action, and fun. And I remember afterward, you, me, and Derek, like, it was already pretty late, and we were just like standing around by one of our cars in the parking lot, and we just like had so much fun watching the movie that we couldn't stop talking about it. And so it's good. Like, a fantastic movie. So but stuff like that, or Pacific Rim, I know there are points in my life like before I was able to appreciate that as much as I ended up being able to later on, where it's like all about that mentality you go in with. And something like Pacific Rim is like, if you're ready to just watch like kaijus and robots just like beat the crap out of each other, and you're not expecting like, hey, this has to like dedicate itself to all these like capital literature type themes, it's like, you can let yourself have an incredible time. And it sounds like this is kind of in the camp of like, hey, let yourself have an amazing time. Sometimes we'll call it popcorn fiction. I don't mean that in a demeaning way. I mean it like you're enjoying it and you're just downing all this popcorn. Which I don't necessarily recommend while you read, because like, especially if it's a lot of butter or like the white cheddar, you're going to ruin the book. And Charles, this was a borrowed book. So I hope you did not get any butter or white cheddar stains on it.
I did not.
But figuratively speaking, a great popcorn book.
That is exactly what I was gonna say. It's I definitely could picture myself eating popcorn while enjoying the story, but I didn't, because you have to maintain the integrity of the books when you got to return it. Also, I would say it's like, and I was thinking of this coming into this episode when I was trying to figure out what am I going to say about the story, and the thing I kept coming back to, it's like a really good like B horror movie or B action movie, and I don't mean that to kind of undercut the story, but I mean it in a way of like, look, this was a low budget story that had a great idea that got popularity and like took off, and you're watching it and you're having fun, because like if you're someone that loves B movies, there's a certain magic about that style of filmmaking that you could love Marvel or Avatar, but it could never capture that magic.
You do mean B movie with Jerry Seinfeld, right?
Yes, BEE movie, where the bee falls in love with a woman. Yes, voiced by Jerry Seinfeld.
Do they, skip ahead if you don't want?
I did just spoil B movie.
B movie spoilers. Do they end up together?
I don't even remember.
Do the bee and the woman end up together?
I know there was like a romance triangle with, a human male, so I don't know. I don't remember. I mean, I only saw it once in theaters maybe 20 years ago, whenever that came out. I don't know how old.
You love when our great artists get experimental and really push the boundaries, like be human romance. So good job, Jerry Seinfeld.
Good
for that
job,
one.
Jerry Seinfeld, and good job, David Dalglish. And yeah, it is a B movie, not BEE. B movie type feel where it's something about the kind of familiarity, the campiness, the grassroots feel of it, combined with just having an entertaining story. It captures a sort of magic that I think a lot of people are B-movie fans for a reason, because it's like you just can't get that in an over-polished like Hollywood movie. And that's what this book does in spades. I would say if you are someone who loves the Cloak and Dagger, grimdark, like Jorg and a Brent Weeks story, then this is the book for you. If I had to lay on some of the criticisms, like with that B movie does come with a bit of like under polished. If you're someone, who I think of like Mistborn, where it's got these kind of intricate little mysteries and hooks and suspense and kind of these shocking reveals and a like well executed complex magic system, like just a little bit of some of that next level. This book doesn't prioritize that. It focuses definitely more on the flashy sequences. And I think that's just David Dalglish playing to his strengths. So that's something to consider. It's literally just you're reading a book of people's like betraying each other, murdering each other, stabbing each other, torturing each other. And some people might think that's a little bit too, it doesn't go deep enough, or there's no like intricate political factions, deep world building, deep lore, deep themes. Like none of that is here, mostly by choice. So I don't want to kind of detract from the story, because like you said, Dylan, you got to know what you're walking into and be prepared for what you're walking into. So that's the thing, or it's something you have to consider. Maybe you're someone that choosing a book and the act of reading is a very precious choice, and you want only the best-selling, best books in the genre, you may skip this one over. But if you're someone who's read Brent Weeks and who's read, all these classic grimdark guys and wants more and just wants to have fun, it's a natural next pick. I did notice, that you also wouldn't be reading this for like being in, I was just coming off of, Spear Cuts Through Water by Simon Jimenez, who is like an absolute poet, and then you read this and it's very direct. There's no flowery language, there's no prose here, and it's not like there's much distinction between characterization beyond their trait. Like, I'm the brute thug and I do brute thug things, I'm the evil king, I do evil king stuff. It makes it way more accessible and entertaining, and I think that's how he found an audience. But it also kind of keeps it from breaking through to like, it's not winning any literary awards, I'll say that, but not every book has to. I would not want David Dalglish to write a book like that unless he really wanted to, because it takes away the magic of what he did create. So I would say that. The other thing is, there's a lot of like, when you're embracing the grimdark and the violence, you're also embracing a lot of like kind of crude moments, which sometimes for me fell a little flat. Like when Jorg, killed people, it was very over the top, and you could be like, oh my gosh, what he did was horrible, but you could kind of couch it in his characterization and in the story. And in this you can, to a certain extent, but it's not as believable as the works like Mark Lawrence. I know it's like unfair to make that comparison, right? To compare anyone to Mark Lawrence, but it does fall a little short on that as well. And that just comes back to, again, you got to realize what your, set your expectations here. We're here to have fun. We're not here to think too hard. And that's what this book's all about. So I feel like when I see criticisms for this book and this story, a lot of it comes down to that. And that's fine. Just be aware of that before you pick up the book. There's also like a weird details of violence and gore and stuff. There's a scene where like a guy is forcibly making out with a woman, and the woman throws up, and then he gleefully like eats the vomit. It's like super nasty, and like it sticks out as being gross. Like not even something I can picture in my brain as something that's possible. And then it happens a second time later. So it's not even like that was just like a weird thing that maybe like you're writing really fast and trying to be gross and intense, but then you come back to it later and you do it again and you're like, this is so bizarre. Like, why is this happening? So I think that comes from that indie public, like the self-published, like trying to write shocking stuff that maybe a agent or an editor would have talked him out of well before it made it into the book. But you know, it's fun that
do we need the second instance of like people vomiting back and forth in each other's mouths? Like, that could be a decent editor's note, but
I would say remove both. But it's not my story, and it made me read something and picture something that I had never read or pictured before. And I always like to give some kind of kudos for a storyteller that can do that.
We're talking about it.
Like, it reminds me of The Boys, where crazy stuff happens in The Boys, and I just can't help but laugh because I would have never thought of something so deranged.
The Boys on Amazon.
Yeah, The Boys on Amazon.
Amazon like, Prime.
I'm just applauded that you thought of something so deranged that never even entered my brain, you know?
If it's deranged enough where it's never entered into Charles's brain, now that is very deranged.
I mean, you could be like, write the grossest thing you can think of, and I don't think I would have ever been like, and then they throw up back and forth in each other's mouths multiple times. You know, it's very bizarre. So there's stuff like that in this book. But, you know, I think weirdly enough, some of those details, one, you don't get them in more traditionally published works that often. So I feel like that's a part of how this audience was cultivated. Like, it's this B-movie magic of this weird stuff that happens in this story, combined with the accessibility of it and the fast pace of it. I feel like there's probably a lot of fantasy readers out there who are like, man, why does every best-selling fantasy book have to be so gosh darn complicated and like so long and flowery and all this other stuff? Like, where's our, you know, where's all the fun and all the traditional grimdark stuff that we used to get 20 years ago? And now like a lot of the mainstream what's getting published and celebrated in fantasy today is not so much this. It's more of like new voices in fantasy and bringing in these real social commentary into fantasy, and we love that. Like, that stuff to me is very modern and exciting, but you kind of forget that there's stories like these out there that are like, you know, the noir cloak and dagger stuff, and I think that's how you're able to kind of cultivate an audience today, is like deliver on some of that stuff. And David Dalglish, it seems like a really nice guy, a really talented guy, and you know, has a background in just writing for fun and growing an audience, and I think that should be celebrated. And it's always nice to see the traditional world celebrating, you know, and supporting self-published authors and picking them up and giving them a platform to spread the story. So I don't want to take any of that away, and I think that's the important distinction here for this book. I don't know if I explained myself well, Dylan. What do you think?
I think you did, and I agree on the idea of celebrating works like this. You know, I'm one of the first to jump to all these like capital L leaning, like I just talked about last week, This Is How You Lose the Time War, which won the Nebula and the Hugo Award. And it's like, that's a lot of what gets people really excited today is these like different books that have, I know we're talking about how the prose is very direct in Dance of Cloaks, and meanwhile, last week I was talking about how some people found the prose too dense, and This Is How You Lose the Time War, and they didn't enjoy it as much as they, like that kind of reader might enjoy something more direct, like what Dalglish is doing. And I think, like I said, I jump toward a lot of these, like, let's explore these big time themes and all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, like, people are reading for their recreation for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can find books like this that have you enjoying your free time and having fun, then I think it's a great thing that we have books like this, that people don't have to be always challenged by the thing that they do for fun. Good to challenge yourself sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
I always, I seek out those books. But it's also good to enjoy yourself when you're engaging in a recreational activity. So glad that these kind of works are being published. And I agree, Charles, that they need to be celebrated as well for what they offer.
Exactly. That's well said, Dylan. And I will say that the first book, it's a long series, like I said, 6 books. So if you're looking to keep the party going, David Dalglish has quite an extensive library already with this series and the half-orc series that came out before it. So there's a lot to get into here, which is good. The first story's mostly self-contained. I mean, it leaves obviously an opening for more stories, but I just wanted to also make the point that you could read the first book, get the David Dalglish experience, and feel like you don't have to then be committed to 5 more books. You could read the one and get a good reading experience and walk away and maybe come back to the second one months later if you wanted to, because I know some people can get intimidated by like, oh, it's 12 books long and here's it's 1,000 pages. No, you can read a 300 page story here and be, well, it's 400 pages, but they're not super long pages, and be done.
I remember you showed me it was pretty sizable font. It seems like pretty.
It looks sizable, but it reads fast. It does. It's like 450 words and pages. I mean, and if it was 450 words, it'd be very short, and you can just you can crank through it. Like I had a good time powering through it, and it's nice to know I don't have to like underline stuff. And it's like, oh, did he tie that theme back from the beginning? Like, it's nice to know I didn't have to have that much dedicated to this. I was able to just enjoy it, and that's the greatest thing I can say about a Dance of Cloaks. And it makes me want to, maybe, who knows, next time we get into Friends Pitching Fantasy, we bring some Brent Weeks into the mix. It's really got me in the mood. So who knows? We'll have to wait and see. Something else, Dylan, I'm sorry to mention, there's no time travel in this story. It's very linear time progression over a short period of time, and everyone is in the present.
Wait, so time just moves forward?
Time just moves forward. There's not even like a whole lot of flashbacks or flash forwards. It's very much a begins at one point in time and time goes on, and then the story ends at the end of the timeline,
Trying to wrap my head around this. So it's like every successive page, the events occur after the events of the previous pages.
Pretty
That's
much.
What you're saying?
Yeah, that's actually a good way to put it. Yeah, that's pretty much. I can't say, I don't remember 100%.
I don't know if I want to read books like that, but everyone knows I somehow ended up really into time travel books. And you know what? You mentioned Mark Lawrence earlier. I was thinking about Impossible Times.
Oh,
trilogy.
Yeah.
When I read that, that's like very time travel-y, timey-wimey.
I've got to read those.
Like to say.
I've got to read those. So, but I remember you recommending them on the show. And that was one we could have added to the list when we were listing all the time travel books you didn't purposely yet still did read.
Oh, there's so many. There's so many. It's like when I stop and think about it, it's actually wacky how many of them there are. But
this
and then I complain about like time travel. It's like so overdone. It's like it's overdone when you specifically choose every time travel book and read them back to back to back. Then you're like,
I'm like, dude, no one's reading as much time travel as you. I haven't read a time travel book. All the ones you've read have been off. You've like gone out of your way to go outside the reading to read time travel books. So it's not even like I even understand. You said that, and I was like, overdone. What are you talking about? So anyway,
it does feel like it does feel like in the broader, I guess, content creation, like entertainment, it does feel like there's a lot of time travel crap.
Yeah, there certainly is. I mean, it can be fun. I mean, hey, we even got like the Avengers. It gets all timey-wimey too, and then you've got like the metaverse, which is a super popular thing for a bunch of like franchises, because they can be like, oh my god, we can tell whatever story we want and still have it be part of the same franchise and throw continuity out the window and sell lots of merchandise. Like we're doing metaverse now, so even at that level, it's getting pretty mainstream. And there's the Spider-Verse as well, which, you know, I'm a big fan of the Spider-Verse. So, yeah, we'll see.
And there's like Dark on Netflix, which is really good. Or at least I watched the first season.
I've heard good really things about it.
It's like Christopher Nolan is like freaking obsessed with time. It's like, it must be, like Tenet, I think, was time travel, and he's always doing time stuff. Even when it's not explicitly time travel, it's like, I guess I shouldn't say what happens in Interstellar. Time is relevant to that. And then, for spoiler reasons, I won't say. But I can say Inception is all like, if like time is really slow, every layer you go deeper into, it's like, I don't know. Enough time. It's like, what's with the time thing? Can't we get into space? More space content. And I don't mean outer space. I just mean focused on the idea of space.
Well, maybe one day. You can be the first one.
Yeah.
But for now, we've got like
space travel. No one's talking about space travel.
Star Trek.
No, I don't mean space like that. I mean literal, like traveling,
like road trip, like indie road trip movies.
Yeah, like time and space. You know what I'm saying? Like time and space, like everything that is like anything that is moving is space travel.
This is more than I wanted to talk about. It was just a throwaway thing about building up your ethos around liking time travel books. It didn't mean to be now a space story,
like a 5-minute.
So I'm gonna kill that now to come back and say
derailment.
A Dance of Cloaks by David Dalglish.
Going backwards.
You know, we've got
in time.
We've got Grimdark. We've got Rogue Thieves. We've got Cloak and Dagger. We've got action, and we've got your popcorn. Experience.
And space travel. People move around, I assume.
Yes.
Move through space.
Yes. It's not purely ethereal, so there is some space and matter involved in this. It's not in a vacuum, so... and we love it for that, don't we, folks? So, if any of this sounds like it could be up your alley, you've got nothing to lose giving this a shot. Yep. Look out for that throw up scene, and just like, let me know if I'm the only one that was like kind of couldn't let that go. Let me know. But otherwise, until the next time, I think we're good here, Dylan.
I think we're good here too, but we're never fully done until we get that sweet, sweet outro music pumping, Charles.
Let's get that outro music pumping, Dylan. Thank you all, one and all, so very much for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. If you like what you heard today, go ahead and find us over on social media. Let us know. We love talking to people over there on the socials. That's at the FTF Podcast on Instagram and at the FTF Podcast with the number 1 at the end on Twitter. Now, Dylan, if they like what they heard today and they want to talk to us over on social media, but they want to support the show even further without spending a dime, what can they do?
Not even a penny. You toss 5 stars to our podcast, which you can now do on Spotify, where most of you are listening. It's just 2 clicks over at the top of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast feed, and we appreciate it so much when you do that. You can also rate and or review at Apple Podcasts, and that is always really appreciated. We love reading those reviews. It puts a smile on my face and probably Charles's face too.
It sure does.
But just listening is more than enough. Thank you so much for doing that.
Guys, you're all awesome just for listening all the way to the end. Thank you so very much for that. We greatly appreciate it. And
is it ever really the end, though? Because when it comes to time,
this is the end. Thank you all so much for listening.
You
and
know,
as
scientists
always,
don't think that time is linear. It's actually
conquer,
totally different from that.
Nope, I'm turning it off.